So in the first two videos, we talked about what imperialism is, what are the motivations and tools that Europeans use to do, and I shouldn't say just Europeans, but Europeans predominantly used to actually imperialize, colonize, and also justify their rules. And then we looked at in the last video about how particularly the British used their rule in India and went from trading company to actual colonial governmental rule, and then talking about some of the changes that they made from that, and then also looking a little bit at the scramble for Africa and also European imperialism in Asia. So in this video, we're going to talk about how Europeans chose to rule, the types of governments involved with that, and then we'll also look at the resistance to European rule, both from settler colonies and also the indigenous peoples, and then the legacies from imperialism. So a lot of stuff here. So obviously, Europeans in many cases, because initially they didn't really want to put down a whole lot of effort, they figured, this will be pretty easy. We let the companies do it. And we saw that sometimes worked out okay initially, but then decided that we need actual government control, government bureaucracy, administrators to essentially try and run this due to low profits, high numbers of death of indigenous peoples, and public outcry both in the colonies themselves and also back at the home in Europe. So they tried to do it through two types of rule. So one predominantly followed by the British, that is the indirect rule, and then one predominantly followed by the French, which was direct rule. Both have their setbacks because there's not enough administrators mostly. Most of them lack knowledge about the land and the people and also caring about them. Some of them have good intentions, others don't. Some of them are just out there for profits and for the empires. Others, they just kind of, again, cut through those, different boundaries from, tribal, ethnic, religious groups that we've seen. Also, part of that's due to, trying to weaken potential threats because rather than, fight the French or the British, how about we get you to fight each other? And that way we'll give, the winner, more say over the loser, give them a little more authority, a little more power. And that way they can look after another group and not have to focus on us. But oftentimes they are essentially forcing the indigenous peoples to work essentially as slaves without calling it slavery. So, and the book does mention that too, and as well, there will be a video included here on the Congo Free State run by Belgium. So the Europeans themselves often live in more secluded, segregated neighborhoods with their families and protected by the military. So in many cases, they don't have to actually deal with it unless they are kind of on the missions, kind of inside the villages and the more rural areas. When they're actually more integrated into the society themselves. So for the bureaucrats, the administrators, they can be very isolated and secluded, I shouldn't say isolated and secluded. They can be very insulated from the day-to-day realities, while the mission workers typically are more included into the actual societies and more secluded and isolated from standard European contact and rule. So within the direct rule used by the French colonies, Europeans will typically work with or choose local officials who they will deem loyal enough to run the colony for them, not allowing for a whole lot of self-rule themselves. They'll typically, if they work with local rulers, it's ones who they can manipulate, typically, again, giving them a lot of needs, again, thinking that they can't take after themselves, but no actual political rights, and neither do they get that in indirect rule either. A little bit of an advancement for the British in India. But again, it comes back to the idea that most of them didn't believe that Africans or other people also in Asia could look after themselves. They didn't believe that they had the capacity for it, and essentially with the racist view of looking at them like children, much as we had seen in American histories with slavery and racism as well. And again, we'll often play groups and peoples against each other to essentially get a stranglehold on their power, and less focus on the Europeans as the enemy. So they very much believed in the assimilation, civilizing mission purpose, forcing their subjects and their institutions to be more like that of the ruling country, like in this case would be France. So forcing them to speak French, go to French schools, imparting French and European cultures and beliefs and standards on them for what would be considered civilized. All right, within India and also other parts of the British Empire, they use existing rulers when they can, those that would be deemed loyal, to handle the local day-to-day affairs, thinking, well, they already have kind of a system set up. Let's let that run out, or let's let them rule it, and let's see how well that works. And occasionally, put in a British law or rule here or there that we deem might be useful or necessary for us to continue to, play a role here. With the colonial powers then handling the big, kind of overarching, kind of mainstream goals. This works well in states with already established strong governments and states, not so much where there isn't an established authority. And so when there wasn't one, again, the British would, or other Europeans would kind of say, hey, we're going to choose this person to run over these people. And it's like, well, that didn't really exist before, so now you're also creating new animosities too. So there's some limited self-rule, hoping that the colonists in some cases might run their own affairs or take more of a control of their local stuff. Now, what are some of the reactions to the colonizing colonies of themselves? So this we're going to talk more about what we call the settler colonies, and the next one we'll talk more about the indigenous colonies that and kind of the things they dealt with. So previous ones that we've kind of mentioned, the United States, Canada, parts of Latin America, had been essentially colonized in some way, and you kind of see that mixture, and we know that history. During this time period, we're looking at it within Australia and New Zealand, but also South Africa. In all these cases, you have the indigenous populations fighting with the settlers, with the Europeans winning out due to weaponry and also diseases that the others were not immune to. And indigenous peoples being relegated to second or third class status, losing their rights, their abilities, their culture, kind of in the ensuing onslaught here. So in South Africa, though, it's a little bit different, a little more complicated, because you also have Europeans fighting Europeans. So it was first a Dutch settler colony, or a Dutch colony that was surrounded by Cape Town as an access point for being able to stop over on the way back into the Indian Ocean or back towards the Atlantic. That was kind of its initial design, and then it became a settler colony afterwards. And they use it under the pretext of what would be similar to manifest destiny. God has given us this land to work with and to use as we see fit, which also includes using indigenous Africans on the continent as slaves. So turning many of the actual inhabitants of the areas that we now know to be South Africa, and also Zimbabwe and a few of these other countries too, into slaveholding states. So the British took over in the early 1800s, kind of again around the time of Napoleon. They abolished slavery when they abolished it in England, so in the 1830s, but the Dutch settlers did not like that. And so, known as Afrikaners or Boers, they went further into the interior away from British rule, where they could have more control over their affairs and again continue to own slavery. But they come into contact with more indigenous peoples, and again they win, again due to diseases and the weaponry. But because once the gold and diamonds are discovered, and also the fact that they're playing fast and loose with the British rules, the British say, okay, we need to put a stamp on this so we get access to those resources, but also show you that the British rule is the intention here and it will continue to rule in this area. And so the Boer War, which is predominantly a war, at least in intention, between the Dutch and the Dutch settlers and the British settlers and British government, that is fought also using a lot of African soldiers on behalf of both sides. And the result of the war is that it leaves the British in full control, but as a concession, this now begins to set up what will become the apartheid system, which is a different form of segregation versus what we see in the United States, similar to the Jim Crow segregation, all right, which is very restrictive, even though the difference here between Jim Crow segregation in the South in the US and apartheid in South Africa is the fact that within South Africa, the Africans are the vast majority of the population throughout the majority of the country. Like 90-ish% are African, and only about 10% are European. And that system will last itself into the 1990s, all right, when it finally comes to an end. So within mainstream, well, not saying mainstream Africa, but within the rest of Africa that is not going through European settlement or colonization, there are other types of resistance, as also within Asia, that will continue to occur essentially until colonization will eventually end. So up until the 1960s and 70s in some cases. But in most cases, they are distractions. It's kind of like a mosquito or a fly swatting, at a human. It's going to be annoying, but, it's hardly ever going to be deadly or cause a really big stir. It's just going to be kind of a distraction and a nuisance, for a, very loose metaphor, if you will. So some of those examples. So within Egypt, and this will tie into the Sudan here, you can kind of see this is the territories that are going to be held in by the British on this half of the continent. On the western side, we also know that they'll have Nigeria and a few other places. So we know that Egypt has been a very, very strong kind of almost semi-independent autonomous state within the Ottoman Empire, resulting from Napoleon. So thank you, Egyptian nationalism. So Muhammad Ali, no, not that Muhammad Ali, built a very strong army and wanted to make it independent and focus on cotton production. But we also have the Suez Canal with access to the Red Sea and over to India that the British are heavily invested in and do not want to lose. So due to debt to the Europeans and high taxes within the population, leading to revolts within the population, again, to pay for this massive military force, the British then decide, hey, we are going to occupy Egypt, and while the Mamluks will continue to essentially rule, it's under the protection, kind of a protection of the British government to ensure that this stays, and also to protect the cotton production, which the British are making a lot of money on, and also access and trade through the Suez Canal, because that is their big link to India, in order to get there very, very quickly in case, again, revolts happen, such as the Sepoy Revolt in the 1850s. So this ties into this image down here with the Mahdi Revolt in the Sudan. So that had been kind of a part of the Egyptian empire, if you will. And so the Mahdi is kind of, he believes himself to be kind of an interpretation of, I believe it is Muhammad, the Prophet Muhammad, coming back down to earth, the kind of known as the expected one. He is here to bring Islam back into its rightful form, and make Islam the dominant force. And so they begin to essentially build up this kind of Islamic army that defeats the Egyptians, that's led by a few British leaders, but predominantly British or predominantly Egyptian army in the 1880s and 1890s. And they kind of embarrasses the British because it's like, hey, these were our allies, and that failed miserably, leading to a really, really big war. But once the British actually bring in their gunboats, once they bring in their actual army and more soldiers, they're able to, again, unfortunately, bring down this, Sudanese revolt, showing, again, more of the power that the Europeans have, where they kill about 20,000 in the span of a few hours in the battle. So one really good bright spot here for Africa, though, is Ethiopia, okay, which is, again, that predominantly Christian nation down here, or nation-state empire, if you will, who, while they're being encroached upon by the Italians in the 1880s and 1890s, actually defeat the Italian army, which, again, will have further implications because the Italians won't forget this, and Benito Mussolini will use this as a reason for him to invade Ethiopia in the 1930s. But, he successfully, or the Italians are successfully defeated by the Ethiopians because they have access, again, to modern technology. There was numerical advantage and better use of their forces and resources, which, the Ethiopians used to their advantage. The Italians, again, thinking, oh, well, we're going to defeat these Africans. But it's the only time that in recorded memory recently where there was a large-scale success to repel a complete European invasion of an African country. The other African country that remains independent at this point is Liberia, which has the protection of the United States, seeing as how the United States had created the country to be an area that protected free slaves who were willing to go back to Africa once they were freed in the 1820s. So that's kind of the other one there. So there's a lot of other revolts that occurred, like we have the Zulu War, Zulu Rebellion again in the 1880s, 1890s, again going down here into the southern parts of Africa. Again, in some of these revolts, they do win battles, they do kill Europeans, but again, any long-term result is not positive for them. But there are other forms of protest that they take that is non-violent, that obviously, again, have limited short-term success, but more long-term success that India will use particularly too, and use very, very well, is, boycotts, publishing articles, forming political parties, using the systems that the Europeans are introducing to their advantage to try and play within their system. And again, much of this is very limited in the initial results, but has long-term results, especially as the world begins to turn, unfortunately, with much of this not occurring until after World War II ends, and then even for some places well beyond that. So that brings us to the final topic we'll wrap up in the final video, which is the legacies of imperialism, leading into both short-term and long-term legacies as well. So not just the immediate aftermath, but also the stuff that has been implicated for a very, very long time.